Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Centre for Criminal Justice Studies for those in the room, and welcome to those who are joining online. We're going to have a lunchtime discussion today. Approach with caution. Does the UK have anything to learn from Texas? And I'm delighted to be joined here by Michele Deitch from the University of Texas and many other things, as Michele will explain when she starts her presentation shortly. I'm going to forego the let's go around the room and everyone can introduce themselves process. I think most of you here know each other, and for those who are online, it would just be tedious to hear you a load of people in a different room from you just talking about themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to move straight on to the main discussion. So we're going to start, Michelle's going to start by presenting the context for what's happened in the prison population in Texas, particularly focusing on the Good Time initiative, but also some of the associated developments. Texas was obviously featured prominently in recent discussions in this country related to the Gauke review. So it's a really timely discussion, and I'm delighted that Michele has been able to join us in person. She's certainly a person of many accomplishments. Prior to the event starting an hour or two ago, when we were just doing the dry rehearsal, she was also advising one of my colleagues who's shortly going to be going travelling in Asia and advising her of all the places that she should go to. And I think there is definitely a future as a travel consultant if they're ever against all the criminal justice work, though hopefully that won't be the case. Without further ado, let's go to Michele, who will talk us through initially a few slides and graphs, just really to kind of set the scene for the discussion. Then we will come back to a bit of a conversation between Michele and I before opening it up for wider discussion with those in the room.
Well, thank you, first of all, so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to just start out by doing a little bit of context and history. I'm not going to talk specifically about sentencing reform in these first few slides, but I want you to understand some of this background. So if we can get the first slide. Okay, so this is a slide showing global incarceration rates for last year. It shows Texas in the United States compared to other NATO countries. And as you can see, Texas is quite literally off the charts. We've got an incarceration rate of 751 per 100,000 individuals, and compared to the UK's 144. So this slide is here to just remind you that Texas is an extremely punitive place when it comes to sentencing and punishment practices. We can have the next slide. Okay, so this is our history slide. This is the growth in Texas's prison population over about a roughly 40-year span. You can see here there's a few points that I want to emphasize. Starting around 1990, or the early 90s, Texas was in crisis, so prisons were in crisis. During the late 80s, or throughout the 80s, Texas's prisons were under federal court order because of overcrowding and various conditions issues. And as a result, a federal judge placed a population cap on the prisons. Now, and this is time that I need to explain the difference between prisons and jails. Prisons in Texas are institutions that are run by the state, and they hold people convicted of felony offenses who are serving sentences of longer than a year. Okay, jails that's a different context, a different terminology. It's not the same thing. Jails are run by counties. They're local facilities that are primarily pre-trial. They're the equivalent of remand. Remand prisoners are being held there, and people who are serving short sentences or misdemeanor sentences of less than a year. So this is just looking at prisons. So as a result of the cap on prisons that went in place around here in the mid-80s, prisoners started backing up in the county jails. They weren't getting transferred to the prisons. So our jails became vastly overcrowded. As a result, during the early 90s, from around in 1991 to 93, there was a very serious sentencing reform effort in place. I can talk about that in great detail. At the time, I was the policy director for our state sentencing commission. But the main things that you need to know are that it led to a shortening of sentences at the low end of the spectrum, of the sentencing spectrum, but a significantly increased sentence length for people who committed much more serious offenses. As a result of those reforms and trying to do something with all the crowding in the local jails, Texas decided to vastly expand the size of its prison system. That is this straight line up here. So starting in 1995, those prisons came online. Texas tripled the size of its prison system. We added 100,000 prison beds at that time. So in the late 80s, at the time I was a court-appointed monitor of conditions in the prison system, we had about roughly 50,000 prisoners. By the time that we finished building those beds, we had 150,000 prison beds. So it's the largest prison construction project the world has ever seen. Okay, so for a while there was extra capacity in the prisons. You know, we overbuilt so that we could bring in the prisoners from the jails. We overbuilt, and for a while there was extra capacity. But as the saying goes, if you build them, they will come, and we very quickly filled all of those beds. So it comes to about 2007, 2008, and there are population projections showing that if we do nothing else, we're going to keep on going like this, and we will run out of space. And the projections showed that we needed 17,000 more beds on top of the 100,000 we had already built. There's like no end to building if you start the building process. And our state leaders decided, they finally got wise to this, and they said, no, building all those prisons didn't make us any safer, it just made us poorer. Let's do something else. So what they decided to do was to solve the problem some other way. So they implemented a variety of non-carceral strategies at this point in time, which we will talk about. And there were continuing reforms made in future years. But the strategies, they not only stopped the pressure to keep on building the beds, but it started slowly bringing down the population. So it stopped the runaway train, which was great because that didn't look like, 10, 15 years, we've just been doing nothing but building. So it stopped that. The population started dropping, and it started plateauing. But we were able to actually close some prisons, which is quite remarkable. Okay. So that happened up until about 2020. You can see the numbers starting to go down. And then 2020, COVID hits. That is the, that is really the first major drop in the population. This was a slow decline, but not a steep decline. COVID was the first steep decline. Okay. So then in 2022, once the courts started opening up again, guess what happened? Population started going up again. All right. And we'll talk about where we are today in just a moment. But I think it's really important that you understand that dynamic, what has happened over time. Okay. So let me now ask you to add the second chart. Now, this is a chart showing Texas's jails. And again, jails are our local facilities that hold mostly pretrial individuals and people doing short sentences. What do you notice here? It's going basically straight up. There's only two drops. One is in 1995 when we added all those prison beds and we pulled out the people who were in the jails, we pulled them into the prisons. And then we started filling up our jails again, and they've been filling up ever since, with a drop in 2020 for COVID. But the jail population is basically continuing to go straight up, except for that. Okay, so it's worth pointing out that there have been some brief but pretty impactful efforts in certain jurisdictions to reduce the number of people being held pre-trial. And for a while, that was, pretty successful. These are people that are being held primarily because of their inability to raise money through a cash bond, for bail.
Yeah.
But there have been state laws passed since then that have basically thwarted those local efforts. So that's one of the reasons why the jail population continues to be on the rise. Now, for a far more accurate depiction of the jail, of the correctional population in Texas would look at a combination of prisons and jails. You really shouldn't talk about just prisons, but most of the analysis has been focused on just the prisons. Okay, and then if we could turn to the next slide, please. Now, this is a recent slide. It was produced by the Legislative Budget Board, which is the budget arm of our state legislature. And you can see it's showing the prison population and the prison capacity of Texas decreasing. This shows it from 2012 down to 2020. But since 2020, going up again, capacity dropped. But guess what's happening? We're about to be overcrowded again. Okay, so a recent report has said that we are about to have a shortfall of 7,000 prison beds in Texas, despite all of our reforms.
Michelle, can I ask?
Yes.
What's the overall population of Texas?
Of the prisons,
No, they come from the state.
oh, gosh.
Approximately.
I should know the answer to that, and unfortunately, it's not at the top of my head right now. Okay, so there are some lessons here that are really, really clear. First of all, Texas has not solved its
No.
cracking problems. Secondly, there's no single magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. And the third lesson is that many strategies provide only short-term gains. Okay, so those are the big takeaways here. That said, I think it's really important to emphasize that Texas did manage to turn the ship around. If we go back to the previous prison slide, we did manage to turn the ship around and stop building prisons. That was huge. It was huge. And we did close down some prisons. And we do understand the importance and the need to invest in community-based alternatives to incarceration. This is a rare area of agreement, bipartisan agreement in the United States and in Texas. And that's nothing to turn your nose up at. That's really, really important. What it means is in Texas, we accomplished something that was not soft on crime, it was smart on crime. And when you understand that, you can understand how Texas became something of a model for the rest of the country. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and we'll have a conversation now about what happened.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I mean, really, really fascinating. One of the things I find so interesting about these slides, and actually the slide on the left there, and indeed on the right, similar pattern, is, thinking from a UK context, the picture is not dissimilar. We also had a big rise in the prison population from about the mid-90s. It kind of then broadly flattened out, maybe slightly later, around 2010. Then we had a bit of a drop during COVID, and now it's on the way back up again. So I can see why policymakers here are kind of interested in the Texas experiment. But clearly, as I think one of your other slide points out, Texas is still off the scale, even with those, even with groups, and actually even I think with my schoolboy maths, based on the 750 per 100,000, even back in the early 90s or mid 90s, your prison population would have been significantly higher per capita than as currently is. So, there are some interesting lessons there. But one of the things that we're looking at today is the good time approach.
Yeah.
So in that time run, when did the Good Time Initiative get introduced? I think the perception here is it was introduced relatively recently to address to arrest the rise in prison.
Right,
I think it happened a bit earlier.
Yeah, so we've had good time. So there's a lot of things to say about good time. I want to explain to you what it is and how it works. But what's important to know is that it's not new. It's not unique to Texas. And it's not what brought down our population. So we've had good time in Texas since about here. Okay, but it's being talked about like it was introduced here. And it's really important because Texas grew its population, tripled its population, even in the years since we've had good time in place.
Yeah.
But something like 42 states have good time laws. It's nothing unique to Texas. Let me explain a little bit about what good time is. It's basically for every day that someone serves in custody, they earn a certain number of days towards their eligibility for release. Okay, and exactly how many days you earn is, it's a very complicated formula. I don't pretend to understand it. All right, I certainly couldn't explain it all, but it depends on your classification status. So someone who is being held in what we call close custody or in administrative segregation, someone with a really bad disciplinary record, they're not earning good time. Someone who's sort of a mid-level ordinary person is probably earning it at a certain number of days. 30 days for every 20 days served, something like that. And if you are a trustee level, so someone who's a particularly well-behaved individual who has earned their way up in time earning status, custody level, you're going to earn it at a higher level. In addition to that, you can earn some days for your participation in various programs. Okay, the idea though is that it is automatic. How much time you earn is automatic based on your time, based on your custody level, your classification status. It's not individualized. Okay, that said, you can lose that credit because you have gotten into, you're found to possess contraband or you got into a fight. You can have your good time taken away from you. Now, the way that good time works though, is when your time served plus the time that you have earned, the good time you have earned, equals, for most individuals, 25% of their sentence, then they can be considered for discretionary parole release. And then for people with more serious crimes, it's when the time that you serve plus your good time equals 50% of your sentence, then you'll be eligible for parole release. Again, it's not a guarantee you actually get out. So the way I like to think about this is good time is a tool for managing behavior and it's a tool for responding to population pressures.
Yeah.
But it's necessary to have it, but it's not sufficient. It's not going to necessarily get people out.
So if it wasn't good time, as it were, that helped to, I mean, we talk about they brought the prison population down. I mean, looking at prison and jail population, looking at those graphs, it seems to me that what Texas managed to do was arrest, as you said, out of control growth, and then actually slightly bring it down, and then COVID was the main kind of factor which brought it down a significant amount.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't good time that specifically helped to arrest that growth and bring it down a bit, what was it that Texas did?
Yeah, so there were three main strategies. The first was that Texas decided to invest much more heavily in community-based alternatives and treatment programs. Like huge amounts of investment, a lot more support for probation. There was incentive-based funding for local probation departments to keep more people in the community rather than sending them to prison. We instituted intensive supervision caseloads, we reduced the size of probation caseloads. We created many more drug treatment programs and mental health treatment programs in the community. So lots of investment in the community and in probation itself. The other big thing that we did was we realized when we analyzed the prison population, we realized that one of the drivers of the population were people being brought back on what we call revocations, what we call recalls. So people who were failing on probation or failing on parole. And the vast majority of these were people who had what we call technical revocations.
Yeah.
So they tested dirty in their urinalysis, or they didn't show up for a meeting with their probation officer. So they violated a term of probation or parole, but they didn't necessarily commit a new offense. That population was very huge driver in the overall prison population. So the reforms targeted that population. We restricted who could be brought back into prison for a technical violation. And we required various forms of graduated sanctions to be tried in the community rather than reincarcerating them.
Yeah.
So those kinds of interventions help to keep a lid on the problem and to reduce it down a little bit.
Exactly.
So, but as your earlier slide pointed out, Texas remains massively off the scale. Even by US standards, never mind, European or many other countries' standards. So, what are the kinds of things that Texas could have done or should have done, maybe to kind of bring it back down to the kind of levels that we had in the sort of early 1990s?
Well, there's what's been described as the ironclad rule of prison populations. It's only controlled by two things: how many people are going in and how long they're staying. So you've got to work on both of those. So one of the things that we did not do was address sentence lengths. Texas is extreme on this front. A very large number of people are serving the sentences of 30, 40, 50 years, life sentences, life without parole sentences. We've done nothing to address that. We've, particularly for people who've committed the most serious crimes, we're not really willing to look at that population at all. We've got very wide open sentence ranges that can, for a first degree felony, can range anywhere from 5 years to 99 years to life or probation. So it can be anywhere in there, and we've done nothing to control that. We also could have put in place something that we like to call second look, where a person serving a really long sentence is evaluated by a judge to figure out, is the rest of that sentence really necessary? Has the person reformed? Can we safely let that person out without risking public safety? So some kind of second look strategy. We could also have the parole board look at factors such as the risk that the person presents today rather than their original crime. In so many cases, the parole board is really looking at how serious was the original crime rather than, is this person still at risk today? We also didn't do anything to make the impact of good time mandatory rather than discretionary. In the old days, pre-1996, it used to be that when your time served plus your good time equaled the length of your sentence, you were released. Now, that was called mandatory supervision. Now, and something that Orwell would have been proud of, we've put in place since 1996, discretionary mandatory supervision. And under discretionary mandatory supervision, when your time served plus your good time equals the length of your sentence, maybe you could get out. But there's no guarantee. So you could still end up doing your entire sentence. That could have reduced the length of stay as well. We also didn't focus enough on jails, as you can see. We've really not done anything to address pretrial incarceration. Although we did invest in in-prison programs during the reforms, we didn't invest enough in that. And so for most people, programming is available only late in their sentence. Sometimes it's only after they've been approved for parole, then they're allowed to participate in a program before they can actually get released. And we didn't do anything to address issues like compassionate release. We've got a lot of very elderly people who are no longer a risk to the community. We could have been addressing that issue. We also could be doing a lot more to address the need to incarcerate women at all. Many of them are not a risk to the community, and they don't need to be there. So those are just some of the strategies, but again, there's no magic bullet. It's really a combination of factors that needs to be addressed.
So, I mean, from the standpoint of where we now are you sort of advocates of the good time approach in Texas? Do you kind of think it was a valuable?
Absolutely.
Policy?
Absolutely. I don't see how any system can function without a good time approach. I think it's absolutely necessary. It controls behavior. It gives people an incentive to behave, to participate in programs, to go to work. And it's a carrot and stick approach. It makes sense to have that. And the policymakers can adjust how much good time is given if they need to control the population. So it brings you closer to eligibility for release depending on how much good time you're earning. So it's an excellent tool, but it's not going to solve the problem because it doesn't guarantee anyone's getting out early. And that's also not the only reason that the population is crowded, or that we've got such a large population.
May I ask a question?
We just, let's
Finish
finish.
I apologise for.
No, we're going to move to questions for a second. I'm just wondering, do you have any other reflections really on what's happened in Texas over recent years, and particularly I suppose some of the lessons there may be for for this jurisdiction?
Sure, and one other point I do want to make about the good time law is that its effectiveness may be limited by the conditions in the prison. So if prisons are violent places, people may have to act out in order to just survive in that environment, which would make it harder to gain to avoid disciplinary offenses. Also, if people are locked up in their cells, for most of the day, they don't have opportunities to participate in program or to show that they're rehabilitating themselves. So there are some limits on that front. But other points that I wanted to highlight, there's a lot of emphasis in the report here about use of electronic tagging, which I find problematic in many ways. I mean, sure, it's good that someone wouldn't be incarcerated, that they'd be in the community, but there's a very serious risk of net widening here. Most people do not need to be on an electronic tag, and it's not without very serious consequences. It's harder for someone to find a job while they're on a tag. It makes women much more vulnerable if people can see that they are wearing a tag. They can be exploited in many ways. It also is much harder for someone to avoid violating, even inadvertently, some of the terms of their release. So it could actually end up getting more people incarcerated, people who wouldn't otherwise need to be incarcerated at all. It also, in some ways, is just a gift for the companies that manufacture these things. So that's one thing I wanted to say about electronic tagging. Another point that's worth emphasizing, I know that the report here talks about diverting people who are going to be serving sentences of less than 12 months, which I think is great. No one thinks that people who only are getting 12-month sentences need to be in there. It's completely disruptive to their lives. It means they can't hold jobs. There's a lot of reasons to not lock up those folks. It provides very little benefit for public safety, but it doesn't go far enough. I mean, first of all, if we had done that in Texas, it only would have affected the jail population. It wouldn't have affected the prison population at all because anyone serving a sentence of less than 12 months wouldn't be in prison. And you could go so much deeper in terms of the population of who can be diverted. I mean, what worked in Texas was diverting so many more people to community-based alternatives. Another point has to do with the recalls for 28 days. The idea of capping recalls is a good idea, but the problem is that most people don't need to be brought back in at all. And they could just be getting graduated sanctions in the community. 28 days is just enough time to really disrupt someone's life. If they had a job, they're not gonna have a job anymore. If their family life is getting disrupted. So I think for minor violations, we need to be looking to strategies other than incarceration.
Thank you very much, Michele. That's a really, really helpful overview of some of the developments in Texas, and we've started touching on some of the relevance of those developments to the United Kingdom and England and Wales in particular. Just to give everyone a quick sense of what we're now going to do. So what we're now going to do is open up the discussion to those in the room for reasons which I'm sure anybody who's ever been in blended meetings, trying to involve people who are joining online in that discussion is technically always going to be difficult. So my apologies if you're joining us online and you want to throw in a thought or a challenge or a question, please use the chat function. We are going to be monitoring that. And in around 20 minutes or so, one of my colleagues is just going to be giving us a kind of a summary of some of the points that have been raised in the chat for the online attenders, and give Michele an opportunity to just respond and reflect on those comments. So please do use the chat function if you're joining us online, and we will definitely come to you. What we're going to do now is just have a bit of a discussion from those who are able to join us in person today. And I wanted to start by asking Andrew Coyle. I'm delighted that Andrew is able to join us today. Many of you will know Andrew, former prison governor, an academic, a kind of an expert on prisons, both in this country and internationally. So, Andrew, I was hoping you might be able to offer a few reflections, a few comments, maybe a few prompting questions for Michele and for the rest of them.
Thank you very much. Firstly, to say that I'm delighted to see Michele here. We worked together quite a number of times in the past on issues like independent monitoring of prisons. So it's lovely to see her again. The last time we saw her was in Edinburgh at the International Festival, and our children were over here. So it's on again this year, by the way. What I'd like to do very, very briefly is set the context, as it were, for today, which is primarily about Gauke, a report, which of course was into sentencing. Over the weekend, I took the opportunity to read it in detail. It's actually quite an impressive report, and I'd recommend it. But one has to say, of course, that it's only the latest in a long line of reports. Very, very briefly, going back, I suppose, within living memory to 1991 was the Wolf Report, which was very well received, and for a short time did seem to be breaking the mold. In 2009, we had the Howard Lee Commission on English prisons, which was called Do Better, Do Less. And some titles of these reports are quite interesting. 2014, we had the British Academy report on a presumption against imprisonment. Last year, we had the Howard Lee again, our critique on sentencing, which was led by five indeed, living former Lord Chief Justices, all of which, taken together, produced an impressive, not quite a blueprint, but pointers for how we may reduce the prison population. But at the same time, the prison population kept going up. 1990, and we're talking about England and Wales here, 45,000 people in prison. Yeah. By 2000, it was up to 64,000. By 2010, it was up to 84,000. Came down a bit in 2020, and back up again to over 80,000 in 2022, and today it's sitting about 87,000. So that's the context, as it were. Those significant increases over the years, which I've just mentioned, there's one outlier, which was 2020, when the prison population reduced by 5,000. The trigger for that is an interesting one. I would say the person who most influenced that was Kenneth Clarke. Kenneth Clarke in the early 90s was the Home Secretary, who at that time was responsible for prisons. He came back as the Secretary of State for Justice in 2010. And one of his first comments when he came back was, when I was Prisons Minister last time, the prison population was 45,000. Today, I find it's 84,000. What on earth has happened? And of course, like any good lawyer, he didn't. If you ask a question, you should know what the answer is going to be. And he didn't know what the answer was. And he worked very hard without any more public inquiries. He worked very hard to look at how the courts were using short sentences. He determined that people with drug addictions or serious mental illnesses should be diverted from the justice system to the health system. And there were a number of other initiatives outside the justice system, with the purpose of keeping people out of the justice system. And that brought it down to 79,000. But then went up and up and up. And I think that's a lesson in terms of the Gauke report. And by the way, the House of Lords Home Affairs and Justice Committee has also just produced a very interesting report on prison management, which is worth reading. But what we must hope, I think, is that the Gauke report will follow in the footsteps of Kenneth Clarke in the second incarnation, who demonstrated that things can be done outside the justice system rather than tweaking inside the justice system.
I mean, I think one of the things that I draw from what you said, Andrew, is that when prison populations rise, it is actually damnably difficult to get them back down again.
Oh, yeah.
And that seems to be the lesson of Texas, where, you know, you did have the equivalent of it, a bit like, as Andrew's just explained, from around 2010, our population did drop a bit, as did Texas. And of course, COVID, it dropped quite a lot, but then bounced up. So there's something which makes them, once you get to a certain level of the prison population, it does seem to remain stubborn.
Very stubborn.
And I'm just wondering if there's any other kind of lessons there from Texas or from the United States more generally, perhaps, about whether there's been any states that have actually been successful in getting their populations there.
There have been states that have been successful. You can look at New York, for example, New Jersey, Connecticut, and there are other states as well that have had very significant drops in their population. I think that New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have each brought their population down by 50% or more, which is a lot. What did they do that's different? There's no magic bullet. It's doing all of these things in a very sustained way. It's about being brave. It's about making tough choices that are sometimes politically not expedient. But they were able to do all this at a time when crime was already on a decrease. So it wasn't putting public safety at risk. And I think the lessons of these states is that you can bring down the population without impacting public safety.
Thank you. And the other point, I suppose, Andrew, one of the main points Andrew was making was that, you know, we've had a litany of reports over the years. I mean, we can go back, I'm sure even further, you know, into the past, you know, in relation to Wolf and everything that came before. And again, it's that kind of sense of here we go again. Here we go again, another report. I'm just going to say what a marvelous report it is. And in 5 years' time, we'll be having another report saying much the same thing. So there feels like there's a bit of a stuck record here as well. And I don't know, my sense is that's been true of Texas as well. And it's only really when you're reaching the point of we are literally about to run out of space. We've got to do something, or we can't afford this anymore. We've got to do something. Those seem to be maybe two of the real kind of, you know, focusing minds moments. Maybe that's where we are.
If I could just add, Richard, going back again to the Wolf report in 91, all of the Wolf recommendations were accepted by the government, apart from one. And that one was that there should be a cap on the prison population.
Yeah.
And there should be stated the prison capacity is X, and that it can't be X plus Y. And in a way, you need something as basic as that. Just as in hospitals, there's a capacity in schools, there's a capacity similarly in prisons. One of the consequences of all the increase, of course, lots of subplots, but one of them is the increase in size of individual prisons. 20 years ago, unbelievable that we have a prison for over 2,000 prisoners. We've been building that for years and continuing to work in that sense.
One comment about the population cap. As you recall, I mentioned that around here, the federal courts placed a cap on the population, which certainly kept the prisons from being overcrowded. And our prisons are not overcrowded in the sense we don't have too many people in a cell. But the problem is, where did those people go? They went into the jails, and the jails were vastly overcrowded. Now, if you had a population cap that controlled people's entry into the criminal justice system at all, so that you reserved whatever incarceration space there is for just the people that most need it. The people you're really, really afraid of, not the people you're angry at. That would be a manageable system. You can't just transfer the problem from one set of institutions to another, though, because that doesn't.
I know Malcolm, you've been waiting very patiently, and I know you.
No, I haven't been patient at all. I've been very.
You've been waiting impatiently.
It's my training, sorry, I was trained to interrupt and let. In one capacity or another, I've been with anguish seeing one report after another come to nothing. And the fact is that I'm terribly troubled that in my lifetime I will see no change. And we tried very, very hard. I remember in the early 1990s, there were Home Office conferences when it was the responsibility of the Home Office. And you, I expect, I know what I'm going to say. I'd go to these conferences, and to my astonishment to begin with, I found that all the senior agency personnel, prisons, police officers, judges, magistrates, and well, they're judges, but you know what I mean. All the agency personnel agreed that we had far too many people in prison of the wrong categories. And it was indeed, it was 45,000 or thereabouts. And so we all packed up and went home, but unlike a lot of conferences, we actually carried on trying. We didn't just think, oh, that was nice, that was a good break, and we saw some interesting people. We kept it up. And honestly, we did at one stage think we had won. And then along came contested by-elections. And along came the Jamie Bulger case. And there were all sorts of reasons why it was back to when parliamentary time permitted. And it was a lack of courage, as you said. But the fact is, we have reached the stage, it seems to me, where we can't drift on. And I was very struck by all you said and all that Andrew said, but I was very struck in particular by this reference to programs and how they could benefit you in terms of good time. You can't run programs if you have several people to two or more people to a cell, and they're bound up for 23 hours a day. And I wonder if that's in the jail system. I dare say that's far from unknown, but I wonder to what extent we're here comparing chalk and cheese, as is always the danger with another nation's system, criminal justice system, and another state's criminal justice system. Sorry, those are the thoughts that immediately sprang to mind. And I so agree with the way you put it, and it's been so clear, but isn't there a danger that we're going actually to assume that we can just take the bits we like and it's going to work? The other thing is that there is self-interest in the tagging companies and those who build and run prisons, and once you outsource, you lose control, and they want the prison population to increase and even agitate for it. Because, of course they do, because it's more profit for them and more profit for the stakeholders, the shareholders, and for the runners of the company. Sorry, that's quite a lot of stuff around.
A lot to get our teeth into. Let's take a few more comments and then right hand. So yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. Apologies, I was late. I had two questions, so feel free to tackle either both or neither of them. Firstly, you very briefly mentioned in your final slide women, and I wondered if this probably a quick question, if you could say a bit whether the trends for women map onto the overall trends. And also, I was curious to hear a bit more about the public appetite for reducing the prison population in Texas. Because that's something, obviously, we've been thinking about that a lot here, with the new government very early on committed to sticking to the previous government's plans to massively increase our prison growth program and to fill those prisons. So I was wondering whether that's been dealt with differently in Texas in terms of public capital.
Rob as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Just a very specific one. So when this good time was introduced, was the early release before? Because the thing that I find strange about the Gauke business is that we already, for most people, let them out now 40% in, was 50%, automatically. We're replacing that. Or is it adding on to it, or how is it going to work? And the Justice Secretary said, actually, under the Gauke scheme, if people misbehave, they won't get out after 40 or 50%, they stay for the full stretch. So I think there are some, plus we're going to make the disciplinary system in prisons even tougher, obviously for public consumption, but you know, there's some equations here that may simply not produce the kind of numbers that the Gauke was set up to produce.
I agree.
So let's pick up Malcolm, Rosie's and Rob's points.
Right.
And we'll come out of there and I think.
Okay. One point I want to respond to what you said, Malcolm, has to do with the investment in programs and the conditions issues, which I think is huge. I alluded to that before as well. I think one of the big mistakes we make is treating prison conditions like they're unrelated to sentencing. And they're very related. I mean, if you don't have an environment that is conducive to people's participation in programs, to improved behavior, and to learning the skills that it takes to be a good citizen on the outside, how do we expect different results? We're not going to get that. So I think at the same time that we're talking about doing sentencing reform and investing in programs, we need to be talking about improving conditions inside. You can't separate those things. So that was the main thing I wanted to respond to there. In response to your points about women are the fastest growing population in Texas and in many other states as well. And yet it's a population that really does not present the same risks as men. I've actually done a lot of work on women's incarceration and the need for very different types of programming for that. But so many of those women can be diverted. It's better for them, it's better for their children.
Growth is rapid.
Yeah, growth is very rapid. And then you were asking also about the public appetite for change. I mean, the public everywhere is pretty uninformed about how this works. And so, of course, there's an instinctive desire for tough on crime types of approaches and for being punitive, particularly in a place like Texas. But as people become more educated about, you know, what results they want people to come out and be good citizens again. They want to feel safe in their communities. And if it turns out that you can actually promote public safety by doing many of the things we're talking about, people get that.
Yeah.
So you have to message it differently, you have to educate the public differently.
Yeah.
Okay. And Rob, in answer to your question about early releases, part of the problem, again, I go back to history, and partially is because I was really old, and so I know a lot of this. But back here, because our prisons had the cap on them and they were so backed up here, people were cycling out of, they were paroling from jail before they ever got into prison. They never made it into prisons. They were getting out having served 8%, 10% of a sentence. And the system had no legitimacy at all. I mean, whatever you think about the length of prison sentences, there's no legitimacy to a sentence if it doesn't mean anything even vaguely like what it, you know, people just knew they'd come in and they'd spend a couple of months in there on a 10-year sentence and then get out. So yes, there was a lot of early release. And one of the things that got implemented during those reforms was to standardize the process of of parole release, so that people are typically serving, we have about a 38% parole approval rate. It's varied from around 33 to 38%, but there's no more revolving door the way it had been before. And your other point about how the good time approach may not produce the numbers is exactly right. There's no guarantee that people are getting out because of good time. And as we talked about before, with conditions being what they are, people may end up losing good time or not being able to earn their way out because there are no programs for them to participate in. So it may not have the desired results.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take 3 quick questions, here, Tara, Tim and Ben, and then we're going to wrap up the discussion here. And then we'll have some feedback from those who have joined us online. So
Thank you. I'm Tara. I'm the Home Affairs, Justice and Equalities Consultant at DOMS. And I just wanted to, I think, mention some of the kind of quite notable publications that have been put out recently. But the Lords Justice and Home Affairs Committee published their Best Prisons report recently, which found that there was insufficient meaningful activity to reduce reoffending. And the HMI Inspectorate of Prisons annual report highlighted that of the 30 prisons they inspected, 28 of them were delivering poor or not sufficiently good outcomes for purposeful activity. So given that context, how effective would like an earned progression or good behaviour credit model actually be in the UK prison system if the infrastructure isn't there to facilitate that?
thank you.
I'm Tim from Howardley. You mentioned sentence inflation as an issue, as we have in the UK. Who sets the sentences in the US or Texas? I'm just sort of wondering, in the UK, say the Home Office or MPs will push for specific offences, but yeah, into the legislature, as well the MOJ are trying to reduce the number of people in prison, so we end up with a sort of oxymoronic situation going on there. So I'm just wondering, is that the same in Texas, and are there any lessons we could learn there?
Yes, and Ben.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben Lincoln. I'm the editor of Inside Time, the prison newspaper. We publish a lot of letters every issue from serving prisoners who often raise with us problems that they are on indeterminate sentences, life sentences, and they can't get onto the programmes that they need to do to convince the parole board that they're safe to release.
Yeah.
And we've had a letter in our most recent issue criticising the UK government's drawing of lessons from Texas in particular, and it is asking. It is saying, isn't this a good time idea, just going to set up a situation where people are beginning told they can have early release if they do the courses, but the courses will not be available because the UK system is clearly incapable of providing enough of them. So my question really is, when you're talking about the programmes, is it just behaviour change programmes, or does it include things like workshops, education if you do a university degree, if you're a firefighter, whatever it is? Does that count as credits, or is it just behaviour change programmes? And is the availability a problem? And somewhere like Texas, that we see is quite litigious, could prisoners sue if they couldn't get early release because the state haven't provided them with access to the behaviour change programmes they need to do?
Such great questions. Hopefully I've written down everything people said. Mia, your point about lack of purposeful activity, I think is a huge issue, right? And this is the point I was making before. If the programs are not there to support people's participation, how do they show that they are earning their good time? So I think it's a huge problem. And and again, this goes to the whole need to invest in better conditions inside. And when I say conditions, I mean everything from programs being provided to lack of violence, etc. So yes, and Tim, the issue about who sets the sentences in Texas. So this varies depending on the state. States all have different sentencing laws.
Yeah.
In Texas, we're unusual because we have there's 2 things you need to know about it. One is that we have a system of jury sentencing, where the jury actually sentences. We're one of only, I think, 3 states that has that. Now, of course, 90-something% of cases don't go to trial, but prosecutors usually choose sentences based on the history of what juries have imposed in the past. What you need to know about Texas sentencing laws, which is very different from most other states and probably very different from here as well, is that we've got incredibly wide open sentence ranges. As I mentioned, for a first degree felony, the most serious felony cases other than capital murder, it can go anywhere from 5 years to 99 years, or life, or probation. So there's huge discretion. And that just gives prosecutors a lot of power to bargain what that sentence will be. And then your question about what counts for, what counts for good time, and the availability and IPP. So, good time is actually earned simply by not getting into trouble. You get it automatically. Okay,
Yeah.
so if you don't have a disciplinary offense, you're gonna earn a certain number of days for each day of your sentence, unless you were in a low classification status, in which case you get 0 days for that. So people who are in what we call administrative segregation, basically solitary confinement, they're probably not earning any good time at all. But other people, just by not getting into trouble, they can also get what's called diligent participation credit, and that's gonna be for anything, going to your job every day, going to your education. It doesn't have to be for something that is rehabilitative in nature, and in fact, we have very few of those kinds of rehabilitative types of programs. Or ones that go towards true rehabilitation. And then could someone sue about that? Probably not. Or would they sue, or wouldn't necessarily be successful. One of the big problems we have in Texas is that for most people, the availability of those programs is not there until they've been approved for parole, which makes no sense at all. In fact, about a few years ago during COVID, my team and I produced a report that we called Dead Man Waiting. And it was about how many people had died of COVID in prison.
Yeah.
Who had already been approved for parole release, but they were still in there because they were still participating in the programs that are no longer in operation because of COVID.
Yeah.
So, it's a real problem.
There are many Orwellian aspects of prison systems around the world, and that's a really good example, isn't it? My colleague Liat's going to give us a couple of minutes on what's been going on in the online chat, and thank you again for those who joined us online, for joining us online, and a special thank you for those who contributed to the chat.
Brilliant. Well, there's been a bit of overlap with some of the discussion in the room about the role of public opinion, trying to eke out the details of what actually makes people eligible for good time. There was a question about whether there is actually any data on the discretionary release decisions. We know what proportion of people are objective. There was also a sort of question about where the data comes from to make good behaviour decisions, and whether there's potential for procedural injustice, which is sort of touched on from another angle just now. And there's another question about what the role for digital education might be, and then there's one more about funding, about making the arguments of shifting resource, I suppose, in reasonable ways, and how that plays out.
So I'm sure there is data on discretionary release. I don't have it at my fingertips now. But there are a significant number of people who's, despite the fact that they have earned good time, are still not being released. Okay, so it's no guarantee of being released. In terms of good behavior decisions, I want to emphasize that these are not decisions. It's not like someone is looking at this person saying, I'm going to give you this number of days. It's automatic unless it's taken away from you, or unless they give it back to you. It's not nearly as individualized as I think that it may be portrayed as at all. So there's no data that's informing that. It's really just, are you in the status? If you are, you getting this number of days. And then digital education is something that seems to be on the rise, particularly it's starting to be employed in the context of people who are in solitary confinement. There are programs bringing some kind of computer-based education into their cells for some portion of them towards the end of their sentence, so that they can get some preparation for release.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. But it's been a really fascinating discussion. I think we don't, I think, you know, when the Good Time initiative was being bigged up by the Gauke Review and by the Secretary of State, I think I probably, like a lot of people, I think probably Texas really, they're really. And I think what today has shown is there's an awful lot to learn from Texas. Doesn't mean it's all good. It doesn't mean that it should be emulated in every way. But I think, you know, international comparisons and learn from what other jurisdictions have done well, as well as badly, is really important. So, Michele, thank you so much for giving me so much to think about and digest over lunch. Speaking of which, there is still food over there for those who are joined us in person, and maybe for our next in-person and blended event, those who joined us online may like to join us in person and enjoy the sandwiches and the conversation. So thank you very much for now, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you again for having me.